I had never known that silence could be so loud until I entered Ashford Hall, and I had never known that a man could write his soul on glass until I watched the Duke trace words I could not read onto a window weeping with winter fog. My name is Eleanor Byrne, and I arrived at the estate on a January morning so cold that the horse's breath hung in the air like ghosts reluctant to depart. I was 23 years old, newly orphaned, and I carried everything I owned in a single canvas bag that smelled of the lavender my mother had tucked between my only 2 dresses before she died. The coach had deposited me at the iron gates just after dawn, and I walked the long gravel path alone, my boots crunching against the frost, my heart beating with a rhythm I did not recognize. It was not fear exactly. It was something closer to surrender. I had never seen a house so large. Ashford Hall rose against the pale gray sky like a creature made of stone and silence, its windows dark, its chimneys breathing thin threads of smoke into the cold. There were so many windows. I counted them as I walked, a habit I had developed as a girl when I could not read, and numbers were my only language. 47 windows on the front face alone, and behind each one, I imagined, a secret I would never be allowed to know. The housekeeper who greeted me was a tall woman named Mrs. Holloway, with silver hair pinned so tightly it seemed to pull her eyebrows into a permanent expression of disapproval. She looked at my bag, at my worn boots, at the way I stood with my hands folded in front of me, like a child waiting to be scolded, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she turned and walked into the house, and I understood that I was meant to follow. I learned the rules quickly. Speak only when spoken to. Never enter the east wing unless summoned. Never look the Duke in the eye. Never ask questions about the family or the past. The other servants whispered these rules to me in the kitchen that first night, their voices low, their faces half lit by the fire that crackled in the great hearth. There were 8 of us who lived in the servants' quarters beneath the main house, and we moved through Ashford Hall like shadows, visible only when something needed to be cleaned or carried or mended. I was assigned to the East Wing. It was Mrs. Holloway who told me, her voice flat, her eyes watching my face for any sign of reaction. The East Wing had been without a maid for nearly a year, she said. The last girl had left suddenly, without explanation, and no one had been willing to take her place. The work was simple enough. Dusting, sweeping, polishing the silver candlesticks that lined the long hallway, lighting the fires before dawn, keeping the library in order, though no one ever seemed to read there, and staying out of the Duke's way. I asked no questions. I had learned long ago that questions were a luxury I could not afford, and besides, I had nowhere else to go. My parents were buried in a churchyard 3 counties away, and the small cottage where I had grown up had been claimed by the landlord before the soil on their graves had settled. I had no siblings, no suitors, no prospects. I had only my hands and my silence and my willingness to work. And if the East Wing was where they needed me, then the East Wing was where I would go. I did not see the Duke for the first 3 days. I heard him, though. I heard his footsteps in the corridor late at night, slow and measured, like a man walking through a dream he could not escape. I heard his voice once, speaking to someone I could not see, low and rough with an emotion I could not name. And I heard the sound of a door closing, again and again, always the same door. Always at the same hour, just before the first light of morning crept over the hills and turned the frost to silver. It was the library door. I began to wake earlier than required, not because I was eager to work, but because I was curious. Curiosity had always been my weakness, my mother used to say. She would find me as a girl staring at the books in the village shop, books I could not read, running my fingers over the spines as if I could absorb their meaning through touch alone. She never scolded me for it. She only sighed and said that curiosity was a fire that could warm you or burn you, and she prayed I would learn the difference before it was too late. I do not know if I ever did. On the 4th morning, I crept down the corridor toward the library just as the first pale light began to seep through the windows. The door was closed, and I pressed my ear against it, holding my breath, listening for any sign of movement within. There was nothing, only silence, heavy and absolute, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath. I turned the handle. The library was vast, lined with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with books whose titles I could not read. There was a fire dying in the hearth, its embers glowing faintly like the last memory of warmth. There were chairs upholstered in deep green velvet, and a desk cluttered with papers, and candles burned down to stubs in their silver holders. And there, at the far end of the room, stood the window. It was a tall window, arched at the top, its glass thick and old and wavy in the way of windows that have witnessed centuries. And it was covered in fog, the condensation of a cold night meeting the warmth of a dying fire. And on that fog, someone had written words. I crossed the room without thinking, drawn to the window as if by a thread I could not see. The words were still visible, though they were already beginning to fade as the glass warmed and the moisture evaporated. I stood before them and stared, my heart pounding, my breath shallow, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt ashamed. I could not read. I had never learned. My father had worked the fields from dawn to dusk, and my mother had kept our small house and tended the garden and nursed the neighbors' children when they fell ill. There had been no time for lessons, no money for books, no school close enough for a girl like me to attend. I knew my letters by sight, the shapes of them, the way they curved and crossed and reached toward one another like hands trying to touch, but I did not know how to make them speak. I did not know how to unlock the secrets they held. I stood before that window, and I looked at those words, and I felt the weight of everything I did not know pressing down on me like a stone. Whoever had written them had written something important. I could feel it. The letters were uneven, trembling, as if the hand that formed them had been shaking. And there was something desperate in their arrangement, something raw, something that made my chest ache, even though I could not understand a single word. The fog continued to fade. The words disappeared. And I was left standing alone in the library, staring at a window that had become ordinary again, holding a secret I could not read. I told no one. I went about my duties that day as if nothing had happened, dusting the shelves and polishing the candlesticks and laying fresh wood in the fireplace for the evening. But my mind would not rest. I kept thinking about those words, those trembling letters, that window that had held a confession I could not understand. And I kept thinking about the footsteps I heard each night. The door that opened and closed before dawn, the voice that spoke to no one in the darkness. The Duke. It had to be the Duke. He was the only one who used the East Wing, the only one who entered the library at that hour, the only one whose presence I could feel even when I could not see him. He had written those words. He had stood before that window in the cold hours before morning and traced his thoughts onto the glass, knowing they would disappear, knowing no one would ever read them. But I had seen them. I had stood where he stood. I had looked at his secrets, even if I could not understand them. I saw him for the first time that evening. I was in the hallway, carrying a tray of candles to replace the ones that had burned down, when a door opened and he stepped out. I stopped. I did not mean to stop. I meant to keep walking, to lower my eyes, to pass him as if I were invisible. But my feet would not obey, and so I stood there, the tray trembling slightly in my hands, and I looked at him. He was tall, taller than I had expected, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes the color of storm clouds before rain. He was perhaps 30 or a few years older, and there was something in his face that made me think of a fire that had been burning for too long. He looked tired. He looked haunted. He looked like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to be seen. And then he looked at me. Our eyes met for only a moment, a single breath, a heartbeat that seemed to last forever. I saw surprise in his gaze, and then something else, something I could not name, something that made me feel as if he had reached inside me and touched a part of myself I had not known existed. Then he turned and walked away, and I was left standing in the hallway with my tray of candles and my pounding heart and the certain knowledge that everything had changed. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters and stared at the ceiling and thought about his eyes, those storm cloud eyes, and the way they had looked at me as if I were not a maid, not a servant, not invisible. He had seen me. For one moment, he had truly seen me. And I had seen him. I had seen the exhaustion in his face, the sorrow that lived behind his eyes, the weight he carried on his shoulders like a coat he could not remove. I had seen a man who wrote his secrets on windows because he had no one to tell them to, a man who walked the halls of his own home like a ghost, a man who had been alone for so long he had forgotten there was any other way to be. I rose before dawn the next morning, earlier than before, and I crept down the corridor to the library door. I pressed my ear against it and heard nothing. I turned the handle and stepped inside. The window was covered in fog again, and again there were words. I stood before them and stared, my eyes tracing the shapes of the letters, willing myself to understand, pleading with some power I did not believe in, to grant me the ability to read, just this once, just these words, just this one secret. But the letters remained silent. They kept their meaning locked away from me, as they always had, as they always would. The fog began to fade, and then, without thinking, without understanding why, I raised my hand and pressed my finger to the glass. The moisture was cool against my skin. I could feel the ghost of warmth beneath it, the memory of his touch still lingering in the place where his hand had been. And I traced a single shape, a single symbol, the only thing I could think to write. A question mark. I did not know why I did it. I did not know what I was asking. I only knew that I wanted him to know that someone had been there, someone had seen, someone had wondered. I wanted to leave my own mark on that window, even if it was only a curve and a dot, even if it meant nothing, even if it disappeared with the fog and was forgotten forever. I stepped back. I looked at what I had done. The question mark stood beside his words, small and uncertain, a single drop of ink in an ocean of text I could not read. And then I heard the footsteps. They were coming down the corridor, slow and measured, the same footsteps I heard every night. He was coming. He was coming to the library, and he would see the window, and he would see my question mark, and he would know that someone had been there. I looked around the room, my heart racing, searching for a place to hide, a way to escape. But there was only one door, and he was on the other side of it, and I could hear his hand on the handle. I could hear the mechanism turning. I could hear my own breath coming too fast and too loud in the silence of that vast room. The door opened, and there he stood, the Duke of Ashford, his storm-cloud eyes fixed on me, his face unreadable, his presence filling the doorway like a shadow come to life. He looked at me. He looked at the window. He looked at the question mark I had traced in the fog, still visible, still waiting for an answer. And then, slowly, impossibly, he smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was not even a kind smile. Not exactly. It was the smile of a man who had been alone in the dark for so long that even a single question felt like light. It was the smile of a man who had given up hope of being found and had just realized that someone had been searching. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and I stood there, frozen, my hands trembling at my sides, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to dismiss me, waiting for the world to end the way I was certain it would. But he did not dismiss me. He did not call for Mrs. Holloway. He did not look at me with the cold disdain I had been warned to expect from aristocrats who found their servants where they should not be. Instead, he spoke my name. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was low and rough, like the sound of wind through winter branches. His eyes held mine, and in them I saw something I had not expected. I saw curiosity. I saw recognition. I saw the same question I had traced on the glass, reflected back at me in the depths of his gaze. He took a step closer, and then another, until he stood before me, close enough that I could see the lines of sleeplessness around his eyes, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of ink and wood smoke that clung to his coat. "You cannot read," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement, spoken softly, without judgment, without accusation, as if he were simply naming a truth we both already knew. I shook my head. "No, Your Grace," I whispered. "I cannot." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his storm-cloud eyes searching my face for something I could not name. And then he turned and walked to the window, reaching up to touch the glass where his words still lingered, fading now, almost gone. "Would you like to learn?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us, fragile and impossible, like a butterfly made of frost. I stared at him, unable to speak, unable to believe what I had heard. A duke was offering to teach a maid to read. A man who spoke to no one was offering to share his words with me. A stranger was offering to unlock a door I had believed would be closed to me forever. I did not understand why. I did not understand what he wanted from me, or what I could possibly give him in return. I only knew that I had spent my entire life standing on the outside of a world made of words, pressing my face against the glass, watching others move through stories I could never enter. And now, for the first time, someone was offering to open the door. "Yes," I said. My voice was barely a whisper, but it was enough. "Yes, Your Grace, I would like to learn." He nodded, and something shifted in his face, some tension easing, some shadow lifting, if only for a moment. Then he turned back to the window, where the last of the fog was fading, taking his words with it, leaving nothing but clear glass and pale morning light. "Tomorrow," he said, "before dawn, come to the library, tell no one." And then he walked past me, his shoulder nearly brushing mine, and he opened the door and disappeared into the corridor, leaving me alone with the empty window and my racing heart and the certain knowledge that my life would never be the same. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the glass, watching the last traces of moisture evaporate into nothing. And I thought about what he had written, those words I could not read, those secrets I could not understand. I thought about the question mark I had traced beside them, small and uncertain, a single gesture in the language I did not speak. And I thought about his answer. Yes, yes, I would learn. Yes, I would come to the library before dawn. Yes, I would tell no one. Yes, I would step through the door he had opened, even if I did not know what lay on the other side. The morning sun broke through the clouds then, flooding the library with golden light, and I felt something stir in my chest. It was not hope, not exactly. It was something quieter than hope, something more fragile, something that felt like the first green shoot pushing through frozen soil after a long winter. It felt like a beginning. I picked up my tray of candles, the ones I had dropped at some point without noticing, and I walked to the door. I did not look back at the window. I did not need to. The words were gone now, dissolved into the air, returned to the silence from which they had come. But they were not lost. Nothing was lost, not really. The Duke had spoken them into being once, and he would speak them again, and perhaps, one day, I would be able to hear them. Perhaps one day, I would be able to answer. I stepped into the corridor and closed the door behind me, and I carried that feeling with me through the long hours of the day, that fragile green thing growing in my chest, that impossible hope I was afraid to name. Tomorrow, he had said, before dawn. And I would be there. I would be there, in the library, in the darkness, waiting for the fog to gather on the glass, waiting for the words to appear, waiting for the Duke of Ashford to teach me the language of secrets. I did not know what would come of it. I did not know if it was wise or foolish, safe or dangerous, the best decision of my life or the worst. I only knew that I had spent 23 years in silence, and someone had finally asked if I wanted to speak, and I had said yes. I did not sleep that night, nor the night after. I lay in the darkness of the servants' quarters and listened to the breathing of the other maids, and thought about words, about letters, about the shape of language on glass. I thought about his voice, low and rough, speaking my name as if it meant something. I thought about his eyes, storm cloud gray, looking at me as if I were not invisible. And I thought about the question I had traced on the window, that small curved line with its single dot, and how he had answered it with an invitation I still could not quite believe. The hours before dawn had never passed so slowly. When the darkness outside my window began to soften, I rose from my bed and dressed in silence, my fingers trembling as I fastened the buttons of my plain gray dress. The other maids slept on, their faces peaceful, their dreams undisturbed. They did not know where I was going. They did not know what I was about to do. And I could not tell them, not because I was ashamed, but because I did not have the words to explain something I did not yet understand myself. I crept through the sleeping house like a ghost, my footsteps soundless on the cold stone floors. The corridors were dark, lit only by the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplaces I passed, and the shadows seemed to press close around me, curious and watchful. I thought of all the servants who had come before me, all the maids who had walked these halls in the centuries since Ashford Hall was built, and I wondered if any of them had ever done what I was about to do. I wondered if any of them had ever been so foolish. The library door was closed when I reached it, and I stood before it for a long moment, my hand hovering over the handle, my heart beating so loudly I was certain it could be heard throughout the house. What was I doing? What did I think would happen? A duke did not teach a maid to read. A man of his station did not spend his mornings in the company of a woman of mine. It was improper. It was dangerous. It was the sort of thing that could cost me my position, my reputation, everything I had left in the world. But I had nothing left in the world. That was the truth I had been trying not to see. I had no family, no home, no future beyond these walls. I had only my hands and my silence and my willingness to work, and those things had never been enough to build a life worth living. They had only been enough to survive, and I was tired of surviving. I opened the door. He was already there, standing by the window, his silhouette dark against the pale gray light of approaching dawn. He did not turn when I entered, but I saw his shoulders shift slightly, an acknowledgement of my presence, a silent welcome. The fire had been lit, and the room was warm, the air heavy with the scent of wood smoke and old books, and something else, something I would later learn to recognize as ink. I closed the door behind me and stood there, uncertain, waiting for him to speak. "Come here," he said finally, and his voice was softer than I remembered, as if the darkness before dawn had stripped away some of the armor he wore during the day. "Come to the window." I crossed the room on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and I stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body, close enough to see the shadows under his eyes and the tension in his jaw. He was looking at the glass, and I followed his gaze, and I saw that the fog had gathered again, a thin veil of moisture covering the window like a secret waiting to be told. He raised his hand and pressed his finger to the glass, and he began to write. I watched, transfixed as the letters formed beneath his touch. They were the same trembling shapes I had seen before, the same desperate curves and crosses, but this time he spoke as he wrote, his voice low and steady, naming each letter as it appeared. "This is an A," he said, "and this is an S, and this is an H." "Ash," I whispered, without meaning to speak aloud. The word escaped me before I could stop it, and I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment at my own boldness. But he did not seem offended. He turned to look at me, and there was something in his expression that might have been surprise, or might have been approval, or might have been something else entirely that I did not yet have the vocabulary to name. "Yes," he said. "Ash, the beginning of my name. Ashford." He wrote more letters, and he spoke them as he wrote, And I repeated them after him, my voice barely audible, my lips shaping sounds I had heard all my life, but never truly understood. The fog was our paper, the window our slate, and as the dawn crept closer and the light grew stronger, the words we created together began to fade, dissolving into the air like dreams upon waking. But I did not forget them. I held them inside me, those letters, those sounds, those first fragile pieces of a language I had hungered for my entire life. And when the last of the fog had evaporated and the window was clear again, I felt something shift in my chest, some door opening, some wall crumbling, some part of myself waking up after a long and dreamless sleep. "That is enough for today," he said, and his voice had returned to its usual low roughness, the softness of the darkness retreating with the coming of the light. "Tomorrow, the same time. Do not be late." He turned and walked toward the door, and I thought he would leave without another word, the way he had left the day before. But at the threshold he paused, his hand on the frame, and he looked back at me over his shoulder. "Eleanor," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke my name that made me feel as if I were being seen for the first time in my life. "Why do you want to learn?" It was a simple question, but it was not a simple answer. I thought of my mother, who had never learned to read either, who had spent her life depending on others to tell her what the words around her meant. I thought of my father, who had signed his name with an X on every document he ever touched, his face tight with shame each time he did it. I thought of all the years I had spent looking at books as if they were locked boxes, beautiful and mysterious and forever beyond my reach. And I thought of the window and the words he had written there and the ache in my chest when I realized I could not understand them. "Because I am tired," I said slowly, the words coming from somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I had not known existed. "I am tired of being outside. I am tired of watching others walk through doors I cannot open. I am tired of silence." He was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes fixed on my face, his expression unreadable. And then he nodded, once, a small movement that felt like a benediction. "Then we will teach you to speak," he said. And he was gone. The days that followed took on a rhythm I had never known before. I rose before dawn each morning and crept through the sleeping house to the library, where he was always waiting, standing by the window, ready to write words in the fog and speak them aloud for me to learn. We moved from letters to sounds, from sounds to words, from words to sentences. He was patient in a way I had not expected, repeating himself without frustration when I stumbled, correcting my mistakes without condescension, treating me as if I were not a servant learning above her station, but a student worthy of his time. I learned his name first, all of it, Henry James Blackwood, Duke of Ashford. I learned the names of the letters and the sounds they made alone and together. I learned simple words, common words, the words that filled the everyday world around me. Window, fire, book, door, hand. And I learned his handwriting, the particular way he formed each letter, the slight tremor that entered his script when he was tired or troubled. I came to know his words as intimately as I knew my own reflection, and I began to see the man behind them, the exhaustion and the loneliness and the sorrow that lived in every line he drew. He never spoke of himself during our lessons. He never told me why he spent his mornings writing confessions on glass, or what those confessions contained, or why he had chosen to teach a maid to read instead of simply dismissing her for seeing what she should not have seen. But I watched him, and I listened, and I began to understand things he never said aloud. I understood that he was carrying something heavy, something that bent his shoulders and shadowed his eyes and kept him awake long into the night. I understood that the fog on the window was his only confidant, the only witness to the words he could not speak to any living soul. And I understood that our lessons were not entirely about teaching me to read. They were also about having someone there, in the darkness before dawn, someone who would sit beside him in silence and ask for nothing but the shape of letters on glass. He was lonely. The Duke of Ashford, master of this great house, owner of lands that stretched beyond the horizon, inheritor of a title that had passed through centuries of noble blood, was desperately, achingly lonely. And though he would never have admitted it, though his pride would never have allowed him to say the words aloud, I could see it in the way he looked at me when he thought I was not watching. I could hear it in the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. I began to feel something I had not expected to feel. It started as gratitude, a simple warmth for the man who was giving me the gift of language. But it grew, slowly and quietly, into something more complicated, something I did not have words for yet, something that made my heart beat faster when I heard his footsteps in the corridor and made my breath catch when our fingers accidentally brushed over the same letter on the glass. I told myself it was foolishness. I told myself I was a maid, and he was a duke, and there were rules that governed the world, rules as old and unyielding as the stones of Ashford Hall. I told myself that whatever I was feeling was nothing more than loneliness of my own, a hunger for connection that had nothing to do with him in particular, and everything to do with the isolation I had felt my entire life. But the heart does not listen to reason. The heart does not obey rules. The heart knows only what it wants, and what my heart wanted, against all logic and propriety and sense, was to understand the man who was teaching me to read. 3 weeks into our lessons, something changed. It was a morning like any other, cold and dark, the fog heavy on the window. He had been teaching me to read short sentences, simple phrases that I could sound out letter by letter, and I had been practicing in secret, tracing words on my own palm when no one was watching, whispering sounds under my breath as I went about my duties. I was getting better. I could feel it. The language that had once been a wall was slowly becoming a door, and with each lesson I pushed it open a little wider. That morning, he wrote a longer sentence on the glass, the letters flowing from his fingertip with the ease of long practice. I watched them form, and then I stared at them, my lips moving silently as I tried to sound out each word. I, for, give, I forgive. But the sentence did not end there. There were more words, more letters, a name I did not recognize. I struggled with them, my brow furrowed, my concentration complete, and I did not notice the way his hand had begun to tremble, the way his breath had grown shallow, the way his face had gone pale in the thin gray light. I forgive you, I read slowly, each word an effort, each sound a small victory. I forgive you, Catherine. His voice cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and sudden, and I looked up to find him staring at the window with an expression I had never seen before. It was grief. It was guilt. It was the face of a man confronted with a wound that had never healed, a pain he had been running from for so long he had forgotten it was still there. Your Grace, I whispered, uncertain, afraid. I did not mean to. He raised his hand, and I fell silent. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the letters that were already beginning to fade, his chest rising and falling with the effort of breathing through whatever storm was raging inside him. And then, without looking at me, he spoke. Catherine was my betrothed, he said, and his voice was hollow, empty, the voice of a man speaking from the bottom of a well. We were to be married 5 years ago. The invitations had been sent. The church had been prepared. The guests had begun to arrive. He paused, and I waited, barely breathing, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had compelled him to speak. 3 days before the wedding, she disappeared, he continued. She left in the night without a word, without a note, without any explanation. I searched for her. I sent men across the country, across the continent. I spent a fortune trying to find her. But she was gone, and no one could tell me why. I did not know what to say. I did not know if there was anything to say. I only stood there, my hands clasped in front of me, my heart aching for the pain I could hear in his voice, the pain I could see in the rigid line of his shoulders. "The scandal nearly destroyed my family," he said. "The rumors were vicious. Some said I had been cruel to her. Some said she had found a lover. Some said she had gone mad. The truth was simpler and more painful than any of them. The truth was that I had driven her away without even knowing I had done it." He turned to look at me then, and his gray eyes were bright with unshed tears, and I saw in them a vulnerability I had not known he possessed. He was not cold, this man. He was not distant or unfeeling or proud. He was wounded, deeply and permanently, and he had been hiding that wound behind walls of silence for so long that he had almost forgotten it was there. "I wrote her a letter," he said, "the night before she left. I was angry about something, I cannot even remember what, something small, something meaningless. And I wrote things I did not mean, cruel things, harsh things, words designed to wound. I left the letter on her pillow and I went to bed, certain that we would argue in the morning and then make peace, the way we always did." He paused, and I saw his hands clench at his sides, saw the muscles in his jaw tighten with the effort of continuing. But when morning came, she was gone, and she had taken the letter with her. She had read every word I wrote, every cruel and thoughtless word, and she had believed them. She had believed that I did not love her, that I did not want her, that I wished to be free of her, and she had granted my wish. I did not think. I did not consider propriety or station or the 1,000 rules that should have governed my behavior. I only stepped forward and took his hand in mine, feeling his fingers cold and trembling against my palm, feeling the warmth of my own skin against his. "You did not know," I said softly. "You could not have known." He looked down at our joined hands, and something passed across his face, some emotion I could not name, some war between the man he had been trained to be and the man he truly was. "I have written to her every day since," he said, "on the window, in the fog. Words I cannot send to anyone because I do not know where she is. Words I cannot keep because they disappear with the morning sun. Apologies, confessions. All the things I should have said and did not. And now," I said gently, "I can read them." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw fear in his eyes, fear and hope and something else, something that made my heart beat faster and my breath catch in my throat. "Yes," he said, "now you can read them." We stood there in silence as the dawn broke around us, our hands still joined, the window clear and empty beside us. And I understood, finally, why he had offered to teach me. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was confession. He needed someone to know, someone to witness, someone to hear the words he had been writing in silence for 5 long years. He needed to be forgiven, and he had chosen me to hear his plea. I did not know if I had the power to grant absolution. I did not know if anyone did. But I knew that I would try. I knew that I would listen, and I would learn, and I would stand beside him in the darkness before dawn for as long as he needed me. Because that was what he had given me. Not just letters and words and sentences, not just the gift of language. He had given me purpose. I released his hand and stepped back, and the moment passed, the vulnerability retreating behind his customary reserve. He straightened his shoulders and lifted his chin, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a duke addressing a servant. "Tomorrow," he said. "Same time." "Yes, Your Grace," I replied. He nodded once and walked to the door, but before he left, he paused again, his hand on the frame, his back to me. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for listening." And then he was gone, and I was alone in the library with the rising sun and the clear window and the echo of his words still ringing in my ears. I stood there for a long time, thinking about Catherine, thinking about letters written in anger, thinking about words that had the power to wound and the power to heal. And I thought about the question I had traced on the window that first morning, that small curved line with its single dot. I had asked a question, and he had given me an answer far deeper and more painful than I could have imagined. Now I just needed to figure out what to do with it. The weeks turned to months, and the months turned to something I had never expected. They turned to hope. By the time the first crocuses pushed through the frozen ground outside the library window, I could read. Not perfectly, not quickly, but truly. I could look at words on a page and hear them speak to me, could trace a sentence with my eyes and understand its meaning without sounding out each letter like a prayer. The Duke had given me this gift, letter by letter, morning by morning, and I treasured it the way a starving woman treasures bread. But he had given me something else, too, something I had not asked for and did not know how to name. He had given me himself. I do not mean that he had confessed his love or made promises or behaved in any way that was improper. He had not touched me, except by accident, had not spoken words that could be misconstrued, had not crossed any of the invisible lines that separated his world from mine. But in those dark hours before dawn, in the quiet of the library with the fog gathering on the glass, he had let me see behind the mask he wore for everyone else. He had shown me his grief and his guilt and his loneliness. He had trusted me with the wound he had been carrying for 5 years, and that trust had become something precious to me, something I guarded as fiercely as I guarded my own heart. I was falling in love with him. I knew it, even though I tried not to admit it, even though I told myself 100 times that it was impossible, inappropriate, doomed. A maid did not fall in love with a duke. A woman of my station did not dream of a man of his. The world did not work that way, had never worked that way, would never work that way no matter how many books I learned to read or how many words I learned to speak. But the heart, as I had already discovered, does not listen to reason. I learned to hide it. I learned to keep my voice steady when I spoke to him, my eyes downcast, my manner respectful and reserved. I learned to fold my feelings away like linens in a chest, pressing them flat, smoothing out the creases, tucking them into the darkness where no one would see. And if my pulse quickened when he entered the room, if my skin flushed when his hand brushed mine over a word on the glass, if I lay awake at night, thinking of his gray eyes and his low voice and the rare, reluctant smile that sometimes crossed his face, well, that was my secret. That was the one confession I would never write on any window. Spring came to Ashford Hall with a softness that felt like forgiveness. The gardens began to bloom, the trees to bud, the air to warm until the mornings no longer required fires in the library hearth. The fog on the window grew thinner, harder to summon, and our lessons began to change. He brought books instead, old volumes from the shelves that lined the walls, and he sat beside me while I read aloud, correcting my pronunciation, explaining unfamiliar words, guiding me through sentences that grew longer and more complex with each passing day. I loved those mornings. I loved the smell of the old pages and the weight of the books in my hands, and the sound of my own voice speaking words that had once been locked away from me. I loved the way he listened, his head tilted slightly, his eyes half closed, as if my stumbling attempts at eloquence were music worth hearing. And I loved the way he looked at me sometimes, when he thought I was too absorbed in my reading to notice, with an expression I could not quite decipher, but that made something deep inside me tremble with recognition. He was feeling it too. I was almost certain of it. There was something in the air between us, something unspoken, something that crackled like lightning before a storm. And even though neither of us acknowledged it, even though we both pretended it was not there, I could feel it growing stronger with each passing day, pushing against the walls we had built, demanding to be seen. It was in this fragile, hopeful state that Lady Philippa Graves arrived at Ashford Hall. I did not know who she was at first. I only knew that a carriage had arrived one afternoon, a gleaming black carriage pulled by 4 white horses, and that Mrs. Holloway had gathered the servants in the kitchen to inform us that we were to be on our best behavior for the duration of the visit. The guest was an old friend of the family, she said, a widow of considerable standing. A woman who had known the late Duchess and who had been a fixture of society for longer than most of us had been alive. I thought little of it. Guests came and went at Ashford Hall, and my duties rarely brought me into contact with them. I continued my work in the East Wing, continued my lessons in the library, continued my quiet, secret life in the margins of the great house. I assumed that Lady Philippa would come and go like all the others, a brief interruption in the rhythm of my days, a face I would glimpse in passing and forget. I was wrong. I first saw her 3 days after her arrival, in the corridor outside the library. I was carrying a stack of linens to the storage room, my head bowed, my steps quick and silent, when I heard voices ahead and looked up to find 2 figures standing in my path. One was the Duke, dressed in his usual dark coat, his expression guarded. The other was a woman I had never seen before, tall and elegant, with silver hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement and eyes the color of winter ice. She was beautiful, in the way that marble statues are beautiful. Cold and perfect and utterly without warmth. And she was looking at me. I stopped, uncertain, my arms full of linens, my heart suddenly pounding. I should have lowered my eyes. I should have stepped aside, murmured an apology, continued on my way. But something in her gaze held me frozen, something sharp and assessing, something that made me feel as if I were being measured and found wanting. "Who is this?" she asked, and her voice was like her eyes, cold and clear and cutting. The Duke's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that might have been warning or might have been fear. "This is Eleanor," he said, "one of the housemaids." Lady Philippa studied me for a long moment, her gaze traveling from my face to my hands to the worn fabric of my dress. I felt myself flush under her scrutiny, felt the heat rise in my cheeks as if I had been caught doing something shameful. "I see," she said finally. "And what brings a housemaid to the East Wing at this hour?" I opened my mouth to answer, but the Duke spoke before I could. "She is assigned to this wing," he said smoothly. "She has been since she arrived. Is there something I can help you with, Philippa?" The use of her Christian name surprised me. It spoke of a familiarity I had not expected, an intimacy that made something cold settle in my stomach. I watched as Lady Philippa turned her attention back to the Duke, her lips curving into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I was simply exploring," she said, "remembering old times. This house holds so many memories, does it not? So many ghosts." There was something in the way she said the word that made me shiver. Ghosts. She was not speaking of spirits. She was speaking of the past, of secrets, of wounds that had never healed. And she was looking at the Duke as if she knew exactly where to press to make those wounds bleed. "I will leave you," I said quickly, finding my voice at last. I lowered my eyes and stepped around them, my linens clutched to my chest, my heart racing. I could feel Lady Philippa's gaze on my back as I walked away, could feel it like a cold hand pressing between my shoulder blades, and I did not breathe easily until I had turned the corner and was out of her sight. That evening, I learned more about her from the whispers of the other servants. Lady Philippa Graves had been a close friend of the Duke's mother, they said. She had been present at Ashford Hall during the season when Henry had courted Catherine, had watched their engagement unfold, had been among the guests waiting at the church on the day of the wedding that never happened. And she had been vocal, in the years since, about her opinions regarding what had occurred. "She believes Catherine was right to leave," one of the kitchen maids told me, her voice low and conspiratorial. "She says His Grace is cold, unfeeling, incapable of love. She has told anyone who will listen that Catherine escaped a miserable fate." I felt anger rise in my chest at the words, hot and sudden and fierce. She was wrong. She did not know him. Not really. She did not know the man who stood by the window in the darkness before dawn, writing apologies to a woman who would never read them. She did not know the gentleness in his voice when he taught me to shape letters, the patience in his eyes when I stumbled over words, the vulnerability he showed only when he thought no one was watching. She did not know him at all. But I could not say any of this. I could not defend him without revealing how I knew, and I could not reveal how I knew without destroying everything we had built together. So I held my tongue and lowered my eyes and pretended that the conversation meant nothing to me, even as my heart burned with the injustice of it. The days that followed were difficult. Lady Philippa seemed to be everywhere, her presence filling the house like a cold draft, her eyes watching everything, missing nothing. I saw her in the corridors, in the gardens, in the drawing room when I passed by on my way to my duties, and every time I saw her, she was watching me, her gaze sharp and curious, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she had not yet named. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself that a woman of her station would have no interest in a housemaid, that I was beneath her notice, that her attention was surely directed elsewhere. But I could not shake the feeling that she knew something, or suspected something, or was waiting for me to make a mistake that would confirm whatever dark theory was forming in her mind. Our lessons continued, but they were different now. The Duke was more guarded, more careful, as if he too felt the weight of Lady Philippa's presence pressing down on the house. He spoke less, smiled less, and there were mornings when I arrived at the library to find him standing by the window with an expression so bleak that I did not dare speak at all. One morning, near the end of her visit, I arrived to find him waiting for me, not by the window, but by the door. His face was pale, his jaw tight, and when he spoke, his voice was strained in a way I had not heard before. "We must be careful," he said. "Philippa suspects something." My heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "She asked me yesterday why I spend so much time in the library," he said. "She asked if I was meeting someone here. She did not say your name, but I could see in her eyes that she had guessed. I felt the blood drain from my face. What did you tell her?" "I told her the truth," he said. "That I come here to read, to think, to be alone." But she did not believe me. She never believes anything unless it confirms what she already thinks. He paused, and I saw something pass across his face, some emotion I could not name, some struggle between the man he was and the man he was supposed to be. "If she discovers the truth," he said quietly, "she will destroy you. She will tell everyone that you have been meeting a duke in secret, that you have ideas above your station, that you are trying to trap me into something improper. She will ruin your reputation, your prospects, your entire future, and she will enjoy doing it." I stared at him, my mind racing, my heart pounding. I knew he was right. I knew how the world worked, how quickly a whisper could become a scandal, how easily a woman like me could be crushed by a woman like her. But I could not bring myself to accept it, could not bring myself to give up the mornings we had shared, the words we had written together, the fragile, precious thing that had grown between us. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, and my voice was steadier than I expected. He looked at me, and I saw in his eyes the same struggle I felt in my own heart. I saw the duty that bound him, the fear that haunted him, the loneliness that had driven him to the window morning after morning for 5 long years. And I saw something else, something that made my breath catch and my heart soar and my entire world tilt on its axis. I saw love. He loved me. The Duke of Ashford, the man who had given up on love, the man who had been writing apologies to a ghost for half a decade, loved me. I could see it as clearly as I could see the morning light streaming through the window, as clearly as I could read the words he had taught me to understand. And in that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, whatever Lady Philippa said or did or discovered, I would not give him up. I would not walk away from the only man who had ever truly seen me, the only man who had ever thought I was worth teaching, the only man who had ever looked at me the way he was looking at me now. "I want you to trust me," I said. "I want you to believe that I will not let her destroy this. I want you to know that whatever happens, I am not sorry for a single moment we have spent together." He stared at me, and I watched the war play out across his face, the battle between hope and fear, between love and duty, between the man he wanted to be and the man the world expected him to be. And then, slowly he reached out and took my hand. It was the first time he had touched me deliberately, the first time his fingers had closed around mine with intention rather than accident. His hand was warm and strong and trembling slightly, and I felt the contact like a brand, searing through my skin, marking me in a way that could never be undone. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion, "I do not deserve you." "Perhaps not," I said, and I felt a smile tugging at my lips, a smile born of courage and hope and the wild, reckless joy of being loved. "But you have me nonetheless." He laughed then, a sound I had never heard from him before, low and surprised and almost helpless. And for one perfect moment, standing in the library with the morning sun streaming through the windows and his hand warm in mine, I believed that everything would be all right. I believed that love could conquer scandal, that hope could defeat fear, that the world could be rewritten as easily as words on a foggy window. But the world, I would soon learn, was not so easily rewritten, and Lady Philippa Graves was already sharpening her pen. The blow came 3 days later, on a morning so beautiful it seemed to mock the storm that was about to break. Lady Philippa had announced her departure for the following week, and the entire household had breathed a collective sigh of relief. The servants moved more freely, spoke more easily, smiled more readily. Even Mrs. Holloway, whose face seemed carved from the same stone as the house itself, allowed a hint of warmth to enter her expression when she thought no one was looking. The shadow that had fallen over Ashford Hall was lifting, and we all felt it, like the first warmth of sun after a long winter. I should have known it was too easy. I should have known that a woman like Lady Philippa did not retreat without victory. I was in the linen closet that morning, counting sheets and pillowcases for the weekly inventory, when I heard footsteps approaching. I assumed it was one of the other maids and continued my work, my lips moving silently as I tallied the numbers. But when the door opened, it was not a maid who stood there. It was Lady Philippa. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, and suddenly the small room felt even smaller, the walls pressing in, the air growing thin. I straightened and clasped my hands in front of me, my heart beginning to pound with a rhythm I recognized as fear. "Lady Philippa," I said, keeping my voice steady, "is there something I can help you with?" She smiled, and the expression sent a chill down my spine. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a cat who had cornered a mouse and was taking a moment to enjoy the terror before the kill. "I have been watching you," she said. Her voice was conversational, almost pleasant, as if we were discussing the weather or the state of the gardens. "I have been watching you for weeks now, and I must say, you are cleverer than I expected. A maid who cannot read, meeting a duke in secret before dawn. It is almost romantic, in a sordid sort of way." I felt the blood drain from my face. "I do not know what you mean, your ladyship." "Oh, but you do," she said, stepping closer. "You know exactly what I mean. I saw you this morning, through the window. I saw you sitting beside him with a book in your hands, your heads bent together, his hand touching yours. It was quite the intimate scene. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything that might deflect her accusation. "He was teaching me to read," I said finally, and my voice came out smaller than I intended. "That is all. There is nothing improper between us." Lady Philippa laughed, a cold, brittle sound that echoed off the walls of the small room. "Teaching you to read," she repeated. "How generous of him. How noble. And I suppose you expect me to believe that a duke would spend months of his mornings instructing a housemaid out of pure, charitable impulse, that there is nothing else between you, that you have not set your cap at him like every other ambitious girl who has ever crossed his threshold? I felt anger flare in my chest, hot and sudden. "I am not ambitious," I said, and there was steel in my voice now, steel I had not known I possessed. "I have no designs on His grace. I have no expectations beyond my station." He offered to teach me, and I accepted, and that is the whole of it. Is it? Lady Philippa tilted her head, studying me with those cold blue eyes. "Then you will not mind if I tell the world what I have seen. You will not mind if I write to my friends in London and describe the touching tableau I witnessed this morning. You will not mind if the story spreads through every drawing room in England by the end of the season." My heart stopped. "You would not, would I not?" Her smile widened. "I have spent 5 years watching Henry Blackwood wallow in his guilt and self-pity. I have watched him reject every eligible woman who has been presented to him, refuse every invitation, retreat further and further into his solitude. And now I discover that the reason for his continued isolation is not grief, as everyone believes, but infatuation with a servant girl who cannot even write her own name. Do you think I will keep that to myself?" I stared at her, trying to understand, trying to find the reason behind her cruelty. "Why?" I asked. "Why do you hate him so much?" Something flickered in her eyes, something that might have been pain or might have been rage. "Because he destroyed Catherine," she said, and her voice was no longer cold. It was hot now, burning with an old and bitter fire. "Catherine was my goddaughter. I loved her like my own child, and he broke her heart with his coldness, his temper, his inability to show her the love she deserved. She came to me the night before she disappeared, weeping, clutching that vile letter he had written. She asked me what she should do, and I told her to leave. I told her she deserved better. I helped her escape, and I have never regretted it." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You helped her leave?" Lady Philippa's chin lifted, defiant. "I saved her. I gave her money and arranged her passage and helped her start a new life far from this wretched house and the man who had made her so unhappy, and I would do it again in a heartbeat." I stood there, my mind reeling, trying to process what I had just learned. All these years, Henry had been searching for Catherine, writing his apologies to a ghost, believing she had fled because of his cruelty. And all these years, Lady Philippa had known exactly where she was. "Does he know?" I asked. "Does he know that you helped her?" "Of course not," Lady Philippa said. "And he never will, just as he will never know where she is or whether she is happy or whether she has forgiven him. That is his punishment. That is what he deserves." I felt something shift inside me, some barrier breaking, some wall crumbling. I looked at this woman, this cold and elegant woman who had held on to her hatred for 5 years, who had watched a man suffer and done nothing to ease his pain, who was now threatening to destroy me simply because I had dared to show him kindness. And I felt, for the first time in my life, that I understood what it meant to be brave. "You are wrong about him," I said, and my voice was calm now, steady, certain. "He is not cold, he is not cruel. He is a man who made a mistake and has spent every day since trying to atone for it. He loved Catherine. He still loves her. And the only cruelty here is yours for letting him believe that she hates him when you know the truth." Lady Philippa's face went white. "How dare you speak to me that way?" "I dare because I have nothing left to lose," I said. "You have already threatened to ruin me. You have already promised to spread your poison through every drawing room in London. What more can you do? Take my position? I have survived worse. Destroy my reputation? I have no reputation to destroy. I am a maid who cannot write her own name, remember? I am nothing." I stepped closer to her, and I saw something flicker in her eyes that might have been surprise or might have been fear. "But I can tell you this," I continued. "Whatever you do to me, you will not succeed in hurting him any more than you already have. He has already suffered enough. He has already paid for his mistakes 1,000 times over. And if you think that exposing our lessons will shame him, you are wrong. It will only show the world that he is capable of kindness, of generosity, of seeing value in someone the rest of the world overlooks. It will show them that he is a better man than they believed." Lady Philippa stared at me, her face a mask of fury and something else, something I could not quite name. And then, slowly, her expression changed. The rage faded, replaced by something colder, something more calculating. "You love him," she said. It was not a question. It was a statement, spoken with the certainty of someone who has just discovered a weapon. I did not deny it. There was no point. She had seen the truth in my face, heard it in my voice, felt it in the conviction with which I had defended him. I loved him, and she knew it, and there was nothing I could do to take that knowledge back. "Yes," I said quietly, "I love him." She smiled then, and it was the most terrible smile I had ever seen. "Then you will do exactly as I say," she said, "or I will make sure that every person in England knows what you are. A scheming servant girl who seduced a grieving duke for his fortune, a social climber who wormed her way into his affections with lies and manipulation. By the time I am finished, no respectable household will hire you. You will be ruined, Eleanor Byrne, completely and utterly ruined." I felt my courage waver, felt the fear creeping back in at the edges. "What do you want?" "I want you to leave," she said. "Tonight, before he wakes. I want you to disappear without a word, without a note, without any explanation. Let him believe you abandoned him, just as Catherine did. Let him believe that everyone he loves will eventually leave. That is what he deserves, and that is what I will have." I stared at her, my heart breaking, my mind screaming in protest. She wanted me to do to him exactly what had been done before. She wanted me to wound him in the same place, the same way, to tear open the scar that had never fully healed and leave him bleeding again. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "Then I will tell everyone," she said simply, "and you will be ruined anyway. At least this way, you leave with your dignity intact. You leave before the scandal breaks. You leave like a servant who simply found another position, not like a woman who was driven out in disgrace." She reached into her pocket and withdrew an envelope, thick and heavy, and pressed it into my hands. "There is enough money here to start a new life," she said. "Somewhere far from here, somewhere no one knows you, somewhere you can pretend that none of this ever happened. Take it. Leave tonight. And never speak to Henry Blackwood again." She turned and walked out of the linen closet, leaving me alone with the envelope in my hands and the weight of an impossible choice pressing down on my shoulders. I stood there for a long time, staring at the money she had given me, thinking about what she had asked. Leave, disappear, break his heart the way Catherine had broken it, and let him believe that he was unlovable, that everyone he cared for would eventually abandon him, that he was destined to be alone forever. I could not do it. Every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea. I loved him. I loved the man who had stood by the window in the darkness and written his secrets on the glass. I loved the man who had taught me to read, who had given me the gift of language, who had seen me when no one else did. I could not repay that love with betrayal. I could not become another ghost for him to mourn. But I also could not let Lady Philippa destroy me. I could not let her spread her poison and ruin whatever small future I might have. I had no family, no connections, no resources. If she made good on her threat, I would have nothing. I thought of my mother, who had survived poverty and illness and the death of everyone she loved, who had faced every hardship with quiet dignity and unshakable faith. I thought of my father, who had worked himself to exhaustion every day of his life and never complained, never wavered, never gave up hope that tomorrow might be better. They had taught me that courage was not the absence of fear. Courage was doing what was right even when you were terrified. I looked at the envelope in my hands, and I made my decision. I would not leave. I would not disappear. I would not give Lady Philippa the satisfaction of watching me break. Instead, I would do something far more dangerous. I would tell the truth. I found him that evening, in the library, standing by the window as he always did, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He turned when I entered, and I saw the smile that crossed his face, the way his eyes lit up at the sight of me, and I felt my heart crack a little at what I was about to do. "Henry," I said, and the use of his Christian name made him still, made him look at me with sudden intensity. "I need to tell you something." I told him everything. I told him about Lady Philippa's visit to the linen closet, about her accusations, about her threats. I told him that she had helped Catherine escape, that she knew where Catherine was, that she had been watching him suffer for 5 years and had done nothing to ease his pain. I told him about the money she had offered me, about the choice she had given me, about the impossible decision I had been asked to make. And then I told him my answer. "I am not leaving," I said. "I know what it will cost me. I know she will try to destroy me, but I will not abandon you. I will not become another person who walks away without explanation. You deserve better than that. You deserve the truth." He stood there in silence, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. I watched the emotions play across his features, the shock and the anger and the grief, and I waited for him to speak, my heart pounding, my future hanging in the balance. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "She knew," he said. "All this time she knew." "Yes," I whispered. "I am so sorry." He turned away from me, his shoulders rigid, his back straight. I could see the tension in every line of his body, could feel the pain radiating from him like heat from a fire. And I waited, not knowing what to do, not knowing if there was anything I could do, not knowing if my confession had helped him or only made things worse. Then he turned back, and I saw that his eyes were bright with tears. "You stayed," he said. "She threatened to ruin you, and you stayed." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He crossed the room in 3 strides and took my hands in his, holding them tightly, his grip almost desperate. "You stayed," he repeated, and his voice broke on the words. "No one has ever stayed." I looked up at him, at this proud and wounded man who had spent so long believing he was unworthy of love, and I felt my own tears begin to fall. "I will always stay," I said, "for as long as you want me, for as long as you will have me. I will always stay." He pulled me into his arms then, holding me close, his face buried in my hair, his body shaking with the force of emotions too long suppressed. And I held him back, my arms around his waist, my cheek pressed against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my ear. We stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's embrace, while the last light of the sunset faded and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. And when he finally pulled back, when he looked down at me with those storm cloud eyes, I saw something in them I had never seen before. I saw hope. "We will face her together," he said. "Whatever she does, whatever she says, we will face it together." I nodded, and I believed him. I believed that together we could survive anything. Together we could weather any storm. But I did not yet know what storms were coming. I did not yet know how thoroughly Lady Philippa had laid her plans, or how far she was willing to go to see them through. I did not yet know that the worst was still ahead. The storm broke 2 days later, not with thunder and lightning, but with letters. Lady Philippa had wasted no time. She had written to every acquaintance she possessed, every hostess in London, every matron with a sharp tongue and a love of scandal. By the time the first responses began to arrive at Ashford Hall, the story had already spread through half the drawing rooms in England. A duke and a housemaid, secret meetings before dawn, an illiterate servant girl who had somehow bewitched one of the most eligible men in the country. The letters arrived in bundles, carried by messengers who could not meet our eyes. Some were addressed to Henry, filled with shock and disappointment and thinly veiled demands for explanation. Some were addressed to Mrs. Holloway, inquiring whether it was true, whether the household had truly fallen into such disgrace, whether there was any hope of salvaging the family's reputation. And some were simply addressed to Ashford Hall, anonymous missives filled with judgment and condemnation, as if the house itself were guilty of the sins committed within its walls. I read them all. Henry insisted that I read them, that I see for myself the cruelty of the world we were facing. He sat beside me as I sounded out the words, his hand on mine, his presence steady and unwavering. And when I finished each letter, when I set it aside with trembling hands and tear-blurred eyes, he would take my face in his hands and remind me that none of it mattered. None of it changed what we had. None of it could touch the truth of what we felt for each other. But the truth, I was learning, was a fragile thing. It could be twisted, distorted, buried beneath layers of lies until it was unrecognizable. And Lady Philippa was a master at twisting the truth. She had painted me as a schemer, a seductress, a woman who had used her helplessness as a weapon to trap a grieving duke. She had painted Henry as a fool, a man so desperate for companionship that he had fallen for the oldest trick in the world. She had painted our lessons as assignations, our conversations as conspiracies, our affection as something sordid and shameful. And the world, hungry for scandal, had believed every word. The servants began to leave. One by one, they gave their notice to Mrs. Holloway, unable or unwilling to remain in a household that had become the subject of such vicious gossip. The invitations that had trickled in over the years dried up entirely. The few friends Henry had maintained stopped writing. Even the tradesmen in the village began to look at us differently, their eyes sliding away when we passed, their voices dropping to whispers as soon as we were out of earshot. We were alone. Truly, completely alone. But we were together. It was during the darkest days of the scandal that the second letter arrived. Not a letter of condemnation, but a letter of a different sort entirely. It came in a plain envelope, addressed in a hand I did not recognize, and it was delivered not by the regular post, but by a private messenger who waited at the door for a reply. Henry opened it in the library, with me beside him, and I watched his face as he read. I watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his hands begin to tremble, watched something shift in his eyes that I could not name. "What is it?" I asked. "Henry, what does it say?" He did not answer. He simply handed me the letter and sat down heavily in the nearest chair, his face buried in his hands. I took the paper and began to read, my lips moving silently, my heart pounding with every word. It was from Catherine. She had heard about the scandal, she wrote. She had heard what Lady Philippa had done, and she could no longer remain silent. For 5 years, she had stayed away, believing that Henry did not want her, that his letter had been a true expression of his feelings, that she had been right to leave. But now she understood the truth. Now she understood that Lady Philippa had manipulated them both, had used Catherine's fear and Henry's pride to keep them apart, had nurtured the misunderstanding like a gardener tending a poisonous flower. She was not asking for forgiveness, she wrote. She was not asking for reconciliation or a return to what they had been. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. She had built a new life, a quiet life, far from the society that had once defined her. She was content, if not happy. She was at peace, if not joyful. But she wanted him to know the truth. She wanted him to know that she had never hated him, never stopped caring for him, never believed for a moment that he was incapable of love. She wanted him to know that the letter he had written, the cruel and thoughtless letter that had driven her away, had been forgiven long ago. She had been young and frightened and too proud to ask for an explanation. She had made her choice, and she did not regret it. But she did not blame him for it either. And she wanted him to know something else. She wanted him to know that she had heard about the maid who had learned to read, the woman who had stayed when Lady Philippa had tried to drive her away, the love that had bloomed in the ashes of his grief. She wanted him to know that she was glad. She wanted him to know that he deserved to be happy, that he deserved to be loved, that he deserved everything she had once hoped to give him and never could. "Be happy, Henry," she wrote. "That is all I ask. Be happy and let the past rest." I set the letter down with shaking hands and looked at the man I loved, the man who had carried the weight of Catherine's disappearance for 5 long years, the man who had written his apologies on foggy windows because he believed he would never have the chance to speak them aloud. "She forgives you," I said softly. "She has always forgiven you." He looked up at me, and his eyes were bright with tears, but they were not tears of grief. They were tears of release. They were the tears of a man who had been holding his breath for half a decade and had finally been allowed to exhale. "I know," he said. "I know." He stood and crossed the room to where I waited, and he took my hands in his, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was joy. It was gratitude. It was love, pure and unguarded and unashamed. "You gave me this," he said. "You gave me the courage to face the truth. You gave me the strength to stop hiding. If you had not come into my life, if you had not traced that question mark on the window, I would still be standing in the darkness, writing letters to a ghost. You saved me, Eleanor. You saved me." I shook my head, feeling my own tears begin to fall. "You saved yourself," I said. "I only showed you that you were worth saving." He laughed then, a sound so full of wonder and relief that it made my heart ache. And then he pulled me close, and he kissed me. It was our first kiss, there in the library where he had taught me to read, where we had traced words on foggy glass, where we had built something precious out of silence and longing and the courage to hope. His lips were warm against mine, gentle at first, and then more insistent, and I felt the world fall away until there was nothing left but the two of us, standing in the light of the afternoon sun, finally allowing ourselves to believe that we might have a future together. When we parted, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath warm on my face, his hands cradling my cheeks as if I were something infinitely precious. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is mad. I know the world will never accept it. I know we will face ridicule and rejection and 1,000 obstacles I cannot even imagine. But I do not care. I do not care about any of it. I only care about you. Marry me, Eleanor. Be my wife. Stand beside me. And let us face whatever comes together." I looked into his eyes, those storm cloud eyes that had once seemed so cold and were now blazing with warmth and hope and love. I thought of everything we had been through, everything we had survived, everything we had yet to face. I thought of Lady Philippa and her letters, of the scandal that was still spreading, of the world that would never understand what we had found in each other. And I thought of my mother, who had married a man with nothing but his hands and his heart, who had built a life out of love and determination, who had taught me that the only things worth having were the things worth fighting for. "Yes," I said. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding was small, held in the chapel at Ashford Hall on a morning in late spring. There were no guests from London, no representatives of society, no one who might have been expected at the marriage of a duke. There was only Mrs. Holloway, who had refused to leave despite everything, and the vicar from the village, who had known Henry since he was a boy and had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the whispers of his congregation. And there was the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows, painting the ancient stones in shades of gold and rose and blue. I wore a simple dress, pale gray silk that Mrs. Holloway had helped me sew from fabric Henry had ordered from London. There were no jewels, no veil, no train trailing behind me as I walked down the aisle. There was only me, Eleanor Byrne, a maid who had learned to read, walking toward the man who had taught her that she was worth more than she had ever believed. Henry waited for me at the altar, dressed in a dark coat, his hair neatly combed, his eyes never leaving my face. And when I reached him, When I placed my hand in his and felt his fingers close around mine, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The vicar spoke the words, and we repeated them. And when he pronounced us husband and wife, Henry kissed me again, right there in the chapel, in front of God and Mrs. Holloway and the ghosts of every Blackwood who had ever lived. And I kissed him back, and I did not care who was watching. The months that followed were not easy. Lady Philippa continued her campaign of destruction, and there were days when it seemed like the whole world had turned against us. But there were also days of quiet joy, mornings spent in the library with books spread between us, evenings spent walking in the gardens as the sun set over the hills. There were nights when Henry held me close and whispered his gratitude into my hair, and mornings when I woke to find him watching me with an expression of wonder, as if he still could not believe I was real. And there was the day, nearly a year after our wedding, when I sat down at the desk in the library and picked up a pen. Henry found me there, staring at the blank page, my hand trembling slightly as I held the quill. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching me, and then he crossed the room and knelt beside my chair. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. I looked at him, at this man who had given me so much, who had opened doors I had never imagined, who had loved me when the world told him he should not. "I am writing," I said. "I am writing my story." He smiled, that rare and beautiful smile that still made my heart skip after all these months. "And what will you say?" I looked down at the page, at the empty space waiting to be filled, at the words that had been locked inside me for so long and were finally ready to be set free. "I will say that I was a maid who could not write," I said slowly, my voice growing stronger with each word. "I will say that I came to a great house on a winter morning and found a man writing his secrets on a foggy window. I will say that he taught me to read, and I taught him to hope, and together we learned that love is stronger than scandal, stronger than fear, stronger than all the cruelty the world can offer." I dipped the pen in the ink and pressed it to the paper, and I began to write. I had never known that silence could be so loud until I entered Ashford Hall, and I had never known that a man could write his soul on glass until I watched the Duke trace words I could not read onto a window weeping with winter fog. Henry read over my shoulder as the words appeared, his hand resting gently on my back, his breath warm against my cheek. And when I finished the first sentence, when I set down the pen and looked up at him with tears in my eyes, he leaned down and kissed my forehead. "It is beautiful," he said. "You are beautiful, and I am the luckiest man in the world." I laughed through my tears and picked up the pen again. There was so much more to write, so many words still waiting to be born. But I had time. I had all the time in the world, because I was no longer a maid who could not write. I was Eleanor Blackwood, Duchess of Ashford, beloved wife of a man who had taught me that I had a voice worth hearing. And I was going to use that voice to tell the world a story about silence and sound, about fog and light, about the words we write when we think no one is watching and the words we speak when we finally find the courage to be heard. A story about love. I bent over the page and I continued to write, and outside the library window, the spring sun shone down on Ashford Hall, warming the glass, chasing away the fog, filling the room with light. And in that light, I found my ending. Not an ending of loss or sorrow, but an ending of beginnings, an ending that was really a start, the start of everything I had ever wanted, and everything I had never dared to dream. The start of us